Hello and welcome to game 41 of Chess.com's CCC 9 event, the Gauntlet Qualification. Andscacs with white started here with d4, Leela replied knight f6, we have c4, e6, knight f3, and now with bishop b4 we get a bogo-Indian defense. Black's idea is that if white now plays knight c3, then he will have to accept maybe doubled pawns on the c file. And if he wants to avoid that with bishop d2, as in the game, then black just quite simply retreats the bishop to e7 and claims that this bishop on d2 is misplaced because it interrupts the queen's defense of the d4 pawn, and black could have an easier job to attack this pawn. The game continued with knight c3, d5, bishop f4, this bishop now had to move again, castles, e3, knight d7, and in this position Andscacs decided to close down the center with c5. This move has advantages but also disadvantages. One advantage of the move is that this pawn on c5 gains space on the queen side. And another one is that by playing c5 himself, white denies black the c5 break, which would allow him to attack white's center and maybe activate these two pieces a bit more. But the move also has disadvantages. By playing c5, white reduced the pressure on the d5 pawn. And after black moves something like c6 to defend the pawn on d5, he could think about getting in the e5 break, which would allow him to either move forward and drive this knight away and get in a kingside attack, or take the pawn on d4, open some lines and weaken white's center. So, in view of this idea with c6 and e5, Leela immediately played here knight h5 to attack this very strong bishop on f4, which is quite active on this diagonal. It's white's bad bishop, but it's outside of the pawn chain and very active, and together with these pawns has a lot of influence on these dark squares. And this bishop cannot be saved. It can be retreated to g3 maybe, but Andscacs prefers to leave it on f4 because now after bishop d3, knight takes and e takes on f4, these two pawns are basically stopping any kind of e5 break by black. So Leela had to resort then to plan B and attack this chain from the front with b6. Her idea is quite simple. She just wants to take here twice and win a pawn. So Andscacs played here b4 to maintain this pawn chain. If black now takes on c5, then he will recapture the b pawn and these two pieces remain inactive. Now, in a little parenthesis, we should mention here that after b6 here, these three pieces are perfectly set up for a Greek gift sacrifice with bishop takes on h7, knight g5 check and queen h5, but it doesn't work because this knight on g5 could be taken out by this bishop. So just a little parenthesis. So after b6, Andscacs played b4 to maintain these two pawns here, and sometimes this rook on a1 is undefended. Let's say there's a bishop on c1 or a knight on g1, and then black can play a5 and white can continue his idea with a3 and maintain the chain, because after black takes and this pawn takes, white would lose this rook. Now of course it's not the case here because the rook is defended and it doesn't work, but sometimes it does. And in this position with this rook defended on a1, black can't really break white's structure. If he takes here, then white will recapture like this. If you take here, then white will recapture like this, and he can maintain the pawn chain here and the restriction on these two pieces. Of course, it would be a big strategical mistake if white would take away from the center here at any point. For example, instead of a3 to take here. Big mistake, because then black takes here and he wins this pawn on c5. And white would have two doubled pawns here on the a file, while black would have a very strong center here with these pawns. As we can see, white's center completely evaporated. So going back to the game, here after Andscacs played b4, Leela played c6, and after a3 she still got in a5 because she wants to get rid of her passive bad bishop stuck in behind these pawns. She wants to play bishop a6 and maybe exchange it for White's very strong bishop on d3. The game continued with castles, bishop a6, knight e5. Now Leela took out the knight, and of course Andscacs recaptured with the f pawn to maintain this very strong bind on black's position. And here Leela decided not to take the bishop. She played bishop c4. And if White would ever take this bishop, then she would have a passed pawn. And if needed, she could even defend it with b5 and make c4 a protected passed pawn. But Andscacs didn't take, and here after bishop c4 he played queen c2, attacking h7, Leela played h6, and now knight a4. Andscacs is attacking the b6 pawn, but not only the pawn, also the b6 square. The pawn can be defended now with b5, but not the square. Once you weaken the square, it remains weakened, and here now this knight takes advantage of it and jumps to b6. But Leela is not very worried about this very aggressively placed knight on b6. She played here rook a7, and she's probably planning here to play a4 and close down the queen side completely, when this knight on b6 would be completely out of play for the rest of the game. It could maybe take this bishop on c4, but then Leela would have a protected passed pawn on c4. So that's why here after rook a7, Andscacs decided to take the pawn on a5, and he wants to play a4 and open the b and a files for his pieces. For example, if the rook takes here on a5, then Andscacs could immediately play a4 here, and Leela would be pretty much forced to take that pawn. But first, in order to not lose a pawn on c4, she would have to take this bishop. If the queen takes, take here on a4, and this knight now would be pretty much saved and in the game, and White has a space advantage on the queen side and could have ideas like rook b6 maybe, and attack c6 and so on. White would stand very well. So in order to distract Andscacs from this plan, after b takes on a5, Leela didn't take this pawn on a5, but started biting at White's central structure from the other side of the board with f6. She wants to take on e5, and if the pawn has to recapture, then her d5 pawn would be a nicely protected passed pawn. So Andscacs took here first the bishop on c4, and after b takes on c4, he played rook e1, and now he's planning to recapture with the rook. If now f takes on e5 and rook takes on e5, then White has a very nice outpost on e5. He's attacking e6, and after bishop f6, rook takes, bishop takes on d4, and rook takes on c6, White would be very active, and this knight on b6 would be now very much in play by attacking d5. After rook e1, Leela played queen e8, and now if the pawn takes and bishop takes, then e6 is defended by the queen. But Andscacs didn't take. He played queen d2 to defend this pawn on d4, and now since taking on e5 is not that appealing anymore, Leela played here f5, leaving the center completely closed. And her point is that her bishop is very much in play on the king side, where the action will happen, while the knight on b6 is very far away, basically in the other half of the world. The game continued now with rook b1. This rook wants to invade to the b6 square. King h7, f3, bishop g5, queen c3, and now h5. Leela is gaining space on the king side for an attack, helped also by the extra piece, this bishop on g5. Queen e1, bishop h6, knight a4. This knight is probably heading home via c3, and it's also allowing this rook to get to b6. Bishop f4, rook f2, h4, and rook b6. The rook gets in, but Leela now plays queen h5, inviting Andscacs to take on c6. Now, what would be Leela's move if the rook takes on c6? Pause the video if you would like to find it yourself. Well, the winning move here is basically queen back to e8, attacking both the rook and the knight, and white loses a piece. So taking on c6 is not good, and Andscacs played here first knight c3, saving the knight, and now rook c6 finally is a threat. And how should now Leela defend that pawn? Which rook should she use now to babysit that pawn? Well, as it turns out, she doesn't want to defend that pawn at all. She played here bishop g3, basically threatening to win an exchange, unless Andscacs dares taking this bishop on g3. But that wouldn't be very wise, because after pawn takes and rook d2, there would be queen h2 check, king f1, queen h1 check, king e2, queen takes on g2 check, and now going to e3 would be very unwise because of this f4 mate. And going to d1 just loses another pawn on f3 with check, and after king c2, the rook takes now on a5, and Leela won 4 pawns for that bishop, and she has also 2 very dangerous pawns on the king side. But after bishop g3, instead of taking the bishop, Andscacs prefer to take the pawn on c6, and now after bishop takes, king takes, rook takes on a5, rook takes on e6, Leela played here h3, trying to weaken those pawns around the black king, and especially the f3 square. If this pawn now would take on h3, then after rook takes on a3, this rook would radiate very strongly on that horizontal. And if this knight would move from c3, then queen takes on f3 would be followed very shortly by mate. And other than that, Leela is threatening to win down the house with queen h4 check. After h3, Andscacs played instead a4, and now there followed queen h4 check, g3, queen takes on d4, queen e3, queen takes on c5, queen takes, rook takes, and now rook d6. Andscacs is attacking this pawn on d5 twice with the rook and the knight, and it cannot be defended. Leela preferred to push that pawn forward to d4, rook takes, and now rook b8. Leela's idea is now to play rook b3 and drive this knight away from the c3 square so that this pawn can march forward and become a queen. And in this position, Andscacs now blundered with rook h4 check, moving this rook away from d4. Backfired on him, but it's very hard to suggest something better. This knight is very hard to defend, it's a very tough position, and if that knight has to move, then this pawn rolls in. Relatively better would have been to play king e3 and give up this pawn on e5 with check, and then play king f4, and after rook c5 play rook d2 and try to defend the knight like this. Instead of this, after rook b8, with rook h4 check and king g8, Andscacs now played king e3, and his idea is now that after rook b3 he will play king d4 and not only defend this knight but also attack this pawn and the rook. But this backfired on him because now Leela played rook d8, threatening rook d3 check and winning this knight. And the whole point of the variation is that now rook back to d4 doesn't work, because after rook e5 check, this king has to leave the defense of the d4 rook. And even though after king f4 he's counterattacking this rook, after rook takes on d4 and king takes on e5, there's rook d3 attacking this knight, and there's nothing to do here. The knight has to leave, and after c3 he has to give himself up, otherwise this pawn rolls in and black wins. So after rook d8, Andscacs played here king f4, but this now allows the rook to invade to d3, chasing this knight away. And after c3, the knight has to give himself up, and Leela is basically a rook up. And even though she loses here a couple of more pawns, eventually she will win down all the white pawns and she will have an extra rook. And shortly she will win the e5 pawn here after a couple of checks. Here, check, check, and there goes the e5 pawn. And then there follows the g4 pawn and the g7 pawn, and all the pawns are gone. And shortly now there will be a rook exchange. And then it's really easy. It's very easy now with the rook and the king. And there's no trolling. Leela is restricting here the white king very nicely. And this is now over after rook a3 mate. Great strategy with black by Leela, but this game has to be remembered for the sad story of this knight which got stranded on the queen side of the world. And by the time he got back to civilization, he was forced to block a passed pawn, and then he even had to give up his life in order to avoid a queen promotion by the opponent. A sad story indeed. Please subscribe, like and share, and check out some of the other videos. Thanks for watching and see you soon. Bye bye.